So you don't have to introduce Zionism and read the tomes that I had read in order to write my doctoral dissertation. Everybody understands white supremacy. If you talk to Americans about white supremacy, they think of the American South, pre-civil rights era. If you think about white supremacy, you think about South Africa, a white supremacist state. So the idea of a Jewish supremacist state, it's not complicated. You understand.
Yeah.
It means where one side has all the rights and the other side has gradations of no rights. Okay? So, and Gideon Levy, the Israeli journalist, he's a very decent guy. He said at one point, fairly recently, he said, quote, Zionism means only one thing in the current world. It means Jewish supremacy. So I think we should steer away from terminology like Zionism, which embraces within its fold a Noam Chomsky and a Benjamin Netanyahu.
Right.
So it doesn't communicate a clear idea, and to use terminology which anyone understands and which actually is accurate. It's a Jewish supremacist state. It's also an obnoxious, self-righteous Jewish supremacist state, but Jewish supremacist, yes.
In chapter 1 of your book, I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It, you say, does one's ethno-racial identity possess a vital essence to be protected and preserved? Or is it a fluke of nature that was instrumentalized to oppress and, in an ideal world, could potentially be eradicated as a social marker? Legacy media is fixated with asking pro-Palestinian supporters this one question: do you recognize Israel as a Jewish state?
Mm-hmm.
Even Zoran Mamdani was badgered with this question during
and he
the
answered
debate.
it excellently.
Yeah. Do you recognize Israel as a Jewish state? And what I don't get is the fixation with this question. Why is it so important to have a Jewish state? And like you brought up, why is it so important to even have an ethno-nationalist state? I had Vijay Prashad on this show earlier this year, and he spoke about how in India as well, there's a sentiment that the government is pushing towards a Hindu state or a Hindu Rashtra. And his counter is that countries thrive on secularism and complexity and diversity. Countries thrive when there's intermingling of culture and trade and food and values. Great cities like New York, San Francisco, London are built on this principle. America was built on this principle. It was built by immigrants coming in from Italy or Ireland or European Jews, Asians, South Americans. Cities and countries thrive when there's secularism. So is there any benefit to having a Jewish state or any benefit of having any ethno-nationalist state? You brought up Quebec and Spain as well.
Yeah, sure there is. Of course there is. And one would have to be very dogmatic to deny it. There's something nice about the ideal of, if you take what is white light? White light when you cut it with a prism. What's white light when you cut it with a prism? I'm asking you.
Splits out into colors.
A rainbow.
Rainbow.
Which do you prefer to look at? White light or a rainbow?
Rainbow.
Fine. So the notion of a multiplicity of nation states, each a different color, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, but of course.
Rainbow nation.
Yeah, rainbow nation. Yeah, that's a very good point. South Africa chose as its motto a rainbow nation. Now, it could have chosen as its motto, the communists, theirs was the red flag. It was one color. They chose the rainbow flag. So there's something enticing about that vision. There's certainly something to be admired in that vision. if you have one people, you'll probably end up having one language. Do you prefer a world that's polyglot? Or do you prefer a world where everybody speaks one language? Some people like the multiplicity of languages. Some people believe their language, Tolstoy couldn't have written in German, and Heine or Schiller couldn't have written in Russian. So there's something obviously enticing in that vision. And the abolition of nations has its price. The question is, to my thinking, as Bertrand Russell, you read at least something in my book on, this is the new edition. And Bertrand Russell writes at one point, we'll find it, don't worry. Here. Fortunately, we have a good index. Bertrand Russell writes, there are always good arguments on both sides of any real issue. There are good arguments for maintaining the reality of nation states and nationalities. But then there's the other side. And the other side is it's very hard to separate out the preservation of nationalities from the preservation of national egos. And it's very difficult to separate out the preservation of national egos from the preservation of national hierarchies, as in we're better than them. And then you can follow the equation, and very quickly it degenerates into all sorts of xenophobic chauvinisms. And it might be the case that the only way to overcome those xenophobic chauvinisms, to really overcome them, is to eliminate the national ego. And I can see that argument. Then you have to decide, which do you think it's worth more to preserve? It plays itself out very simply in any local situation. Let's take the case of Jews, which I know better. So, right now, Jews are intermarrying at a rate of about 60%. Okay, they've gotten out of the ghetto. So if a Jew is in college, the likelihood is of the 30 classmates, maybe one other is, or two others are Jewish. Okay? So if he's going to meet a mate, there's a very high probability that that person is not going to be Jewish, because Jews are only 2% of American society. All right? Now, if he or she marries the mate, then the likelihood that the child is going to identify as Jewish is very small. Why? Well, which would you rather celebrate, Christmas or Hanukkah? Christmas is a national holiday. You get Santa Claus. You get Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Hanukkah, you get what's called a dreidel. It's just, you have to choose. You're going to go with the mainstream culture. Jews being a minority, So sometimes in some Jewish communities, it's called the second Holocaust, this intermarriage. Because what Hitler didn't manage to do, this embracing culture has succeeded in doing, namely, next generation after intermarriage, only 30% identify as Jews and only 10% identify as Jews, and then Jews are gone. So I have friends, or I had friends, who didn't want, they were very open-minded, very liberal, the Barack Obama types. But they drew the line. They did not want their children to marry non-Jews because they wanted to preserve the Jewish tradition. They wanted to preserve the Jewish heritage. They wanted to preserve the Jewish culture. And they knew there was only a small probability that if they intermarried, the Jewish culture tradition would be preserved. I could see their argument. As Bertrand Russell said, there are always good arguments on both sides in any real issue. But I don't support it. Ultimately, I believe that love should triumph over all, and even if it's at the expense of preserving one's culture and tradition. And I do believe the national egoism in an ideal world has to be rid of.
There are good arguments on both sides, but on your side, you're definitely in good company because there are great men like Frederick Douglass, who was denounced by the Afrocentrics of his times for lacking in quote-unquote black pride. W.E.B. Du Bois spoke about how he was clutched by the unity beneath all of life. Even Edward Said echoed these sentiments in his memoir.
These are all very illustrative examples because Edward Said went through several metamorphoses. Originally, he was just an English professor.
Yeah.
He had no visible manifestations as a Palestinian. When the Third Worldism, as it was called, set in, beginning after World War II, with decolonization, the fact that what were called third world countries were stepping forth, India, Egypt, Indonesia, they were stepping forth, then a notion of pride in one's nation among third world countries unfolded. And Professor Said sort of reinvented himself as a Palestinian. And then at the end of his life, he became a universalist again. His last major collaboration was with an Argentinian Jew, Barenboim. It was called the West-Eastern Divan, which was trying to create to rise above ethnic difference. So I think those are difficult questions. And I can't say who, in my opinion, handled them perfectly. I think everybody struggled with finding the right balance. I've struggled with finding the right balance.